one way to get around it?
Get around the First Amendment?
Get around any of these restrictions. I mean, that's what they did in England. The British government just called in all the computer companies and said, we've got to do something about all this pornography and indecency as threats to the children.
Right.
And you guys better get together and set up some sort of a private...
The kinds of things that the industry did would violate the antitrust laws, yeah.
Well,
but
maybe if they touch on price, or that. But I mean...
No, family viewing hour.
Yeah,
No. Well, that's one case, but actually the NAB code case, which happened to be my case, only dealt with the economic aspects, the limitations on the number of commercials. And the NAB code included, as you know, a whole bunch of other restrictions on products which could not be. And the government was explicit in saying that if the industry wanted to get together and restrict that sort of stuff, it was fine. I'm surprised that hasn't popped up.
I know, but just so used to those sorts of co-regulation arrangements, and I don't think you would, in this country, be able to get around First Amendment requirements simply by saying, okay, let's bring in the NAB and the NCTA and other industry groups and tell them what policies you want them to implement. I think you would have
Well, I mean, you wouldn't have to tell them. I mean, they're going to be even more restrictive probably than the government.
We tried to do that after the NAB case. This is the cable industry. And we went to justice to say, having nothing to do with advertising or anything, could we set up standards like the NAB code? And they said no. And they cited the code case. So.
Yes.
Yes. When you were at the Federal Communications Commission,
Yes.
there was a complaint filed
I knew
about
it.
a song by The Who
Yes.
that had been playing on American radio stations thousands of times.
That is true.
Since the 1960s. What happened to that complaint, Mr. Corn-Revere?
Well, by the time that complaint was decided, I had left the FCC, so my memory of it is kind of hazy. Actually, this is
You're under oath.
one of those diner stories. When I was at the FCC, I was legal advisor to Jim Quello, who had been a commissioner for, in the end, 23 and a half years, and final years, when he was, well, my final year was when he was chairman. But one of my jobs as his legal advisor was to deal with the broadcast indecency cases. It was an area which the boss knew that I was a tad uncomfortable with the commission's position, but I was his lawyer, I was representing him, and I felt my obligation was to try and figure out what the legal position actually was. So my job as a legal advisor was to try and make sense of the case law that the FCC had on broadcast indecency, which wasn't an easy thing to do because there wasn't any case law. It was all rather impressionistic. It was politically motivated in many cases. You would have legal advisors getting together in a room looking at transcripts of radio broadcasts, which didn't tell you anything about what you actually heard on the radio. And then they would discuss basically in terms of what their boss's levels of tolerance might be for, if someone were aware, they condoned that being on the radio. And all of the cases at the time were radio cases. And so I decided that I could best perform that role if I tried to collect all of the information that I could about decisions that the FCC had rendered in cases, and more importantly, because no one had this information, what cases they had dismissed. And so whenever I had an intern, the job was to go to the informal letter dismissals and collect them, so that when I went to these meetings of legal advisors, I could say, well, there are 3 other cases like this one where we've dismissed them. So what I tried to do was bring sort of a sense of the rule of law to this lawless area. Well, finally, we did receive a complaint, as Tom suggested, involving a Mount Vernon, Illinois radio station that had broadcast the Who song, Who Are You? And I heard it a million times. I had no idea that Rodney Daltrey sang Who the Fuck Are You? And, maybe it was the accent. I don't know. It just escaped my attention. So I called the bureau and asked them to bring a copy of the recording to my office. And I listened to it, and I kind of heard it once and didn't really hear it another time. And I realized I really didn't have an argument for when I went to this meeting to say, well, there's precedent one way or the other for what we should do about the song. But what I did that I took in the meeting was that if we find a station for airing a classic rock song that had still was being broadcast 10,000 times a day across America, that the agency would be a laughingstock. And so I expressed the opinion in the meeting that we really couldn't find this station because they laugh us out of the room. And for the first time, people sort of said, maybe Corn-Revere has something. All those other arguments he makes, that's this might make some sense. We're going to look foolish. And being lame, I couldn't resist following that up by saying, besides, maybe it wouldn't be a bad precedent if 2 bucks are okay. And everyone stopped what they were doing. And put the complaint in a drawer. And it sat there for about 3 years. Until later, once I was back in private practice, I remembered seeing the release of a dismissal for the Song of the Warrior. I think the rationale was that the language was unintelligible. But in any event, that's what happened in that case. But now, of course, you don't have radio stations airing Who Are You with that language in it, because since 2004, since the FCC has cracked down on fleeting expletives, no one's going to take a chance on airing that. And in fact, there is a pending complaint involving the Live 8 concert from going back to 2004, where the Who was performing at the Live 8 concert. They did Who Are You? Apparently they didn't bleep one at a time when Roger Daltrey sings Who the Fuck Are You? And so that complaint is still pending at the FCC. And the irony here, speaking of convergence, this actually does relate, the same concert was broadcast in its entirety, and not in the abbreviated form on ABC, online. And the online audience for kids was 4 times the size of the broadcast audience. And of course, it is completely unregulated by the FCC. And no one cares what Roger Daltrey sings in the online version. Nevertheless, we're still waiting to see what the FCC is going to do with the complaint.
Tell the Louis story.
We got lots of them.
Well, all I can tell you is I got the Freedom of Information Act information on Louis Louis.
It's the Kingsman song.
The Kingsman song, Louis Louis, which was investigated by something like 6 different FBI field officers for whether or not it was scenes.
You have to play it backwards.
No, even playing it forwards, no one could figure out what the hell they were saying.
I wasted a lot of vinyl trying to hear it backwards.
No, that was the Beatles.
No, that was Louis Louis.
Louis.
Louis Louis, you have to play backwards.
They've been giving bad information.
Do you think there's any First Amendment problem with the delays which are associated with these complaints?
Yeah.
You know, a complaint is filed with the FCC and it may just languish there for 4 years, 11 months, and 29 days before.
It's outrageous. And beyond that, license renewals have been delayed because
Yeah.
of pending indecency complaints. At least before this chairman, you had an act campaign by the FCC to pressure broadcasters into tolling the statute of limitations, or to pay a deposit if they wanted a license renewal in the event that there might be a fine in the future. Okay, so you have all of these things going on. Now, 15 years ago, a number of broadcasters challenged the FCC's indecency policies based on those very things, on whether or not it went on too long. And the court was uneasy with it, just barely affirmed what the FCC had done. And those practices were nowhere near what they are now. At least, until recently, I can't really speak to the General Counsel Commission, whether or not they've been as bad. But yeah, I think the procedural aspects of what the FCC does with broadcast indecency raise serious concerns.
Okay, if you could all join me in giving a nice hand for it. So our speaker's encyclopedic knowledge can be further exploited just outside the doors here at the atrium. We'll be having a reception right now, and have at him while he's drinking and eating, and you're doing the same. Thank you very much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you at our next event.